Hi, welcome to the grades 7 through 9 book video. I'm Dr. Shannon Whiteside, Program Director for the Alveary, and I'm here today with a few of our curriculum developers, Catherine Avery, Carrie Forney, Danielle Merritt-Sinceri, and Dr. Meredith Donaldson-Clark. This is the 10th year of the Alveary, and we are so excited to give you a preview of some of the books we will be reading for the 25-26 school year. If you want to learn more about the Alveary, you can browse our viewbook, which is linked in the video description below. The viewbook also contains a free term of art lessons for you to try out. I want to reiterate that we are just highlighting some of the books that are part of our curriculum. There are many more. I also want to remind you that although the books are an important part of the lesson, there is more to a lesson plan than reading and narrating books. While Charlotte Mason cautions us as educators against the temptation to over-explain, she encourages teachers to share brief comments to rouse students' interest and prepare them to engage with the lesson. In Alveary lesson plans, we often give discussion questions, pertinent background information, links to pictures or maps, and other similar activities, so you can put your students and yourself in the right attitude toward the lesson. For 7th and 8th grade students who are starting to work much more independently, the lesson plans themselves often function as the instrument to help a student rouse their interest in the day's work.
And before we go into the books, we just wanted to also encourage you to take a moment and watch the videos we made about how we choose books. We cover the questions that we ask ourselves when we're considering books each year. And we just hope that that gives you sort of the background on what we're thinking and our goals, and also the information that you need to tailor the curriculum to your students. So we suggest you click over to those videos and then come back, and feel free to reach out to us via our website or social media if you have questions after exploring samples or listening to these videos. And we're always happy to talk about books and ideas. That is one of our favorite things, obviously.
All right, so let's begin with Bible. Charlotte Mason considered Bible lessons a critical part of a student's life. She wanted every day to bring new thoughts of God, new hopes of heaven, she says in school education. She didn't want Bible lessons to be moralistic and children to feel like the Bible's a list of do's and don'ts, but for students to know God as their Father and King and Jesus as the Savior of the world. From 7th grade through high school, students read through the Old Testament chronologically, and we'll be reading Joshua through 2nd Samuel, as well as 1st Chronicles and the Psalms that were written during that time period. They'll use this resource, Old Testament Today, A Journey from Ancient Context to Contemporary Relevance, by John Walton and Andrew Hill. This book will be used for several years as they read through the Old Testament and gain a deeper understanding of interpreting the Bible. It's so important for students to understand the context the Bible was written in and what it meant to the original audience. However, it's also important to understand how the Old Testament writings are relevant to us today. The authors do a wonderful job communicating these ideas. We will provide guidance in navigating this book as well as other links from the Bible Project to help as well. And we encourage students to use the ESV Student Study Bible in 7th and 8th, or the Cultural Background Study Bible in high school, because it contains many helpful notes that explain the verses and provide a stepping stone for when they'll use commentaries and other Bible study helps in the future. For New Testament, 7th and 8th students are reading the Harmonized Gospels using the book, The Gospel of Jesus, the 4 Gospels in a Single Complete Narrative by Lorraine Bettner. The Gospel of Jesus is one continuous, highly readable gospel account that is placed in chronological order with locations and dates. Students will also read fascinating Bible studies on every parable by Dr. William Marty. This book provides background information and explanations of key concepts to help the students appreciate the fullness of Jesus' parables and what they meant to his hearers and what they mean to us today.
Our Bible lessons also include readings about men and women from church history, from the historical period we are studying. For 2025 to 26, we are studying the time period of 1650 to 1800 AD. For church history, 7th through ninth graders will continue in the series by Luke Davis. The next book is titled Renewal, the Church that Expands Outward. They will be reading about half of the book as they learn about Christians who use their talents to expand the kingdom of God through preaching, missions, or writing. Some of the people in the book include Cyril Lucaris, an Orthodox patriarch of Constantinople in the early 17th century, the Puritans John Bunyan and John Owen, and Henry Hosier, the first Black man to preach to a congregation in America. Students will also read the biography of George Whitefield by Arnold Dallimore. This biography focuses on Whitefield's evangelistic ministry and his passion for reaching people with the gospel. While the focus is on Whitefield, the author does an excellent job of defining the historical context in which Whitefield was preaching. And he mentions John and Charles Wesley and even his friendship with Ben Franklin. Whitefield's reach through open-air preaching was far and led to revival in the church in both England and America.
And to finish out our Bible lessons, we have a strand of spiritual formation where students read about various topics. And this next year said the 7th and 8th graders will be reading Praying the Bible and Disciplines of the Christian Faith. And both of those are by Donald Whitney. Praying the Bible is a short book, but it really points to a struggle that many Christians face. That question of how do I keep my mind from wandering when I'm praying? And Whitney encourages the reader to use the words of the Bible, especially the Psalms, as a format and a template, and as the words even of your own prayers. And he lays out a plan that can be implemented in students' lives and right away, but then hopefully also, as they continue.
I really love this book, Praying the Bible, and I actually use it in my own personal devotional time. But I'm also excited that I just found out that there's also an app. And it's called Five Psalms. So that's another way to access the Psalms in a quicker way and then decide which one you want to pray that day.
And his other book is The Spiritual Disciplines for the Christian Life. And that one introduces students to important disciplines like scripture reading and worship and journaling and serving and more. And along the way, he includes people from church history. So students are sort of naturally introduced to the thoughts and ideas of other theologians and scholars like Jonathan Edwards and Charles Spurgeon and Francis Schaeffer. And this is another book that students sort of can grow into and can keep with them as they continue to grow and mature and deepen their faith. And then ninth graders sort of think about the big picture of the Bible with a book called God's Big Picture. And that one gives the overview and sort of how all the different books fit and the books and genres fit together into one big whole. And that has been a staple in the curriculum for many years and sets the stage for a lot more of the depth that comes in the study in the high school years.
Yeah, that's a very helpful book. I've personally found it fascinating to kind of think about that as the whole story and how it fits together. For architecture, moving to that, the 7th and 8th graders will read Colonial Living. And through detailed descriptions and line drawings, Edward Tunis provides students a glimpse into the past to see the houses and the churches, the schools, everyday tools and equipment that were used by the American colonists in the 17th and 18th centuries. This book is also a great resource for the Book of Centuries. It has amazing line drawings. That's what it's really had sort of been famous for, is his illustrations. Allowing students to pick different things of interest that stand out to them and add that to their Book of Centuries. And because the line drawing being very straightforward and simple, it's a great one to be able to kind of take that and copy it into your page for all the material culture of the time. So it's hard to find sometimes books that have simple but detailed enough pictures that are interesting and engaging that students can use. So we're really excited about this book and the potential for that, helping them to really kind of get a sense of this is what the world looked like, and this is what your day-to-day world looked like. These are the things, the artifacts, the pieces around you that we take for granted in our world around here, but how very, very different it was at these other times. And then in ninth grade architecture, one of the fascinating books is called Home Building and Woodworking in Colonial America. It also has wonderful line drawings that are great for the Book of Centuries. And it just details this process of home building from the wood that's used all the way up to the iron hinges on the door. I mean, it goes through the tools. It talks about, yeah, how we just don't think about now, you order your wood and it comes on a truck, right? Or it's just a process we don't even really think about what was entailed. And when they were doing everything by hand and the different wood and how they made the stairs or whatever it might be, that's just been a fascinating, again, look into a different time and a different place and what those processes were like. And then we use the 50 buildings that you should know to provide an overview of famous architecture from 1650 to 1800. This book will be used for all the history rotations in high school. So you want to keep hold of that one. Don't let it go. Because we just study the buildings and the things that relate to the time period, and then we'll use it for other ones as we go through history.
I think architecture is also a great example of just the way the lesson plans, like the books are essential to the curriculum, but the lesson plans give us the ability and the internet to do so much more because we can bring in, links or videos of some of these actual places, or, maybe there's a building that isn't covered in one of those books or something you want to bring out. And the lesson plans allow us to really pull all those resources together into one place that's easy to use, but then gives us access to so much more of that breadth, which, I think is really important.
So along with architecture, let's also talk about history. So the history of our world has a lot of wonderful moments, and it has a lot of dark moments. And we believe that a balanced approach is the best way to learn history. As Christian scholar Ronald Wells states, honest history means more than merely telling the truth in factual terms, but also telling the truth in all its complexity and ambiguity. We want our students to humbly pursue a deeper understanding in their engagement with the past. And just as the people in the Bible were full of human frailty and blind spots, so are the people throughout all of history. We believe that when we approach history with honesty and an openness to seek the truth as best we can, students can be transformed in their hearts and minds as they enter into a dialogue with the people from the past and strive to understand their stories and their contexts and their worldview. If we just imagine historical characters as one-dimensional figures, we'll either make them out to be an idol or a monster. The only way we can love our neighbors is to know their stories, hear their joys and their hurts, and show an interest in their lives as people created in the image of God. That's the power of history approached as a living subject. The ideas and people students read about from the past can affect them today as they process what it means to be an image bearer, what it means to love your neighbor, and what it means to be part of the kingdom of God. Knowledge without love puffs up. It must be balanced with love and empathy. This year, we're studying 1650 to 1800 AD in US and Canada history, as well as world history, and then 550 to 100 BC in ancient history.
One of the books that 7th and 8th graders will be reading is Countdown to Independence by Natalie Bober. She seeks to look at both the British and American side and asks the question, what forces were at work that swept these people into a conflict that ultimately precipitated a shocking revolution and severed the ties between Britain and her American colonies? She focuses on the period from 1760 with the crowning of King George III until the completion of the Declaration of Independence in 1776. And she tells the story through the eyes of the heroes and rebels involved on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. I especially like this book because it is a good bridge between elementary school and high school and helping students get ready for um, the books that we have in high school and thinking through these ideas. So it's a little more challenging, but um, not as challenging as what they will get in when they enter high school. And so the ninth graders will read the second half of American Colonial History by Thomas Kidd. And in this book, he tells the story of the colonies through the themes of religion and conflict. He continues to be a great guide as we walk through this time period. Kidd's book provides source documents at the end of each chapter, which will be helpful to think through perspectives. The ninth graders will also be reading A Little Book for New Historians by Professor Tracy McKenzie, which introduces to students what it means to think like a historian. He has a wonderful way of helping us to recognize the complexities and nuances of history, leading us to love of God and love of neighbor in the process.
There will also be a Canadian history option for Canadian students. One text we will use for students in grades 7 and 8 is L. Audra Warner's The Hudson Bay Company Adventures. Now, Canadians all know the Bay. If you grew up around the same time I did, you probably followed your mom around the department store on a Saturday afternoon. But what you might not know is the history of the Hudson Bay Company, which started during our period of history from two French fur traders, and it became an institution that eventually claimed to own nearly 40% of what is now Canada. There were battles with a rival fur trading company, and eventually the Hudson Bay Company moved from trading posts to the model of mercantile stores all around the country. What I like about this book is that it introduces readers to the people involved who often we don't hear about, and it links the history of the Hudson Bay Company to larger events that were happening during this period. Another way we will learn the history of pre-Confederation Canada is through historical fiction. A novel that we'll read together this year is called My Indian, a recent writing by Chief Misael Joe and Sheila O'Neill, who are both members of the Micmac First Nation of Newfoundland and Labrador. It's the story of Sylvester Joe, who accompanied William Cormac on a journey through the center of Newfoundland. William Cormac was born to a Scottish family in Newfoundland, and he set off on an unprecedented trek to find the last remaining traces of the Beothuk people. He took with him an Indigenous hunter, that's Sylvester Joe, but in his notebooks, Cormac only referred to him as my Indian. This novel reimagines this journey from the perspective of Sylvester Joe and his desire to protect the Beothuk people, but also his need to fulfill his commitment as a guide. It is also an engaging introduction to Indigenous culture, as this book opens with the marriage ceremony of his parents, and we learn about Sylvester Joe's early life. The upcoming school year during 2025 and 2026 will also have more content for Canadian families, as we are introducing a stream of Canadian history for high schoolers. Grade 9s and 10s will learn together. One of the ways that they will learn about history is through historical fiction, and they will be reading the book My Indian, along with the grade 7 and 8s. But they will also learn about the period through reading and analyzing primary sources. One book I'm very excited about that the grade 9s will read is a book by Tyler LeBlanc called Acadian Driftwood, One Family and the Great Expulsion. This book is written by a man from Cape Breton who did not realize that he had Acadian ancestors. He'd been told a story about where his family came from, and while he knew about the Acadian expulsion of 1755, he didn't realize he had a personal connection until he happened to have a conversation with a genealogist. And so this book follows his ancestor and 10 of his siblings after the expulsion and what happens to them as they are sent away from Acadia in Nova Scotia to all different parts of the world. Their journeys are all different. These 10 siblings end up in different places, just as the Acadian people were scattered throughout North America and into Europe, such as England and France, among other places. And as we follow these 11 people, we will learn about the wider events of the latter half of the 18th century and how their lives intersected with large movements of this period. It's a book of creative nonfiction where he does not invent dialogue for the characters. He's drawing that from letters and from diaries, but he does expand a bit on their situations and imagines how they might feel. And it's really special for the personal connection that he has with this story. It can show us how hundreds and the history of hundreds of years ago can feel less remote and have a profound effect of those living today as they realize a direct connection with the history, even from, the 200-300 years ago that we're studying during this year.
Those sound amazing, Meredith. I cannot wait to dive into those myself. It's just such a fascinating look at what was going on and the interconnectedness across so many different places in that event. So thank you for that. So for ancient history, we're studying the time period of 550 to 100 BC. Seventh and eighth graders will read the ancient Greek world. This book is written by experts in their field, but especially geared for students. And the authors tell about the people and the events of the past and in a very engaging manner by tying in archaeological finds, highlighting primary sources as well throughout the book. This book is a part of a great series that shows history is not only concerned about what happened in the past, but historians and archaeologists continue to study the records of the past and look for artifacts that can illuminate what life was like for the people who lived before us. It's that ongoing study, right? Like they're continuing to look and to learn and to study and to observe and figure out, okay, how do these pieces go together and what can we really understand from them? So for world history, students in grades 7 through 9 will continue with the book 1493 From Columbus's Voyage to Globalization. This book helps students understand both the positive and the negative effects that resulted from the Columbian exchange of goods and people between the Old World and the New World during the Age of Exploration in the 15th century. This thought-provoking book gets past the facts of history to explore the ideas that still affect us today. The author takes the reader around the world to places such as China, Spain, Ireland, South America, Africa, to show how all of these places became more interconnected after the voyages of Columbus. They will also read the book A Parcel of Patterns by Jill Patton Walsh. This historical fiction novel that takes place in the 1660s is based on true events and people from the town of Eyam, a small town in rural England. The narrator uses the language and register for time to portray the effects of the plague and what their town did to help stop the spread of it. It's a fascinating read.
And Carrie, don't you have a connection to the town of Eyam?
Yeah, as a child, I have relatives from England, and we actually had gone here and I'd seen this like a marker on the side of the road going into the town, that type of thing that talked about this. And I remember as a young child just being fascinated by the fact that there was all of this history that had happened. And, it was sort of that come to life moment, like, oh, there were people in the past who lived here and did different things and had a life here. It's not just what I'm seeing as a tourist walking through this town. Then later I came across this book and was reading it and with my kids and was realizing that, wait a second, I think I've been here. One of those moments of this sounds really familiar. So yeah, I loved that book for a very long time.
Yeah, it's a interesting book. It's a sad subject, obviously, but it's done in written so well, and it's hard to put down. So we'll have to hide it so students don't read the whole thing in 1 or 2 sittings.
I was going to say too, before we jump on to the next subject, that though the ninth graders are reading a little book for new historians, if you are in, your students are 7th and 8th grade, or you have older students and who haven't read this book, this is just a great book that as a teacher resource or just really to keep on your shelf, just because Dr. Mackenzie has just been so helpful in helping us think through in just a few pages. Like, it's not a big book, it's a little book, it truly is. But just in a few pages, help us think through, just the whole approach to history. And as a teacher resource, I think it provides the background, some context, but then also a lot of ideas on how to draw out and just really have deeper conversations and think about some of these ideas that your students are reading about. So just a little plug for that book, regardless of what age your students are. It'll be either pre-reading for when they get to 9th grade or just an enriching read anywhere along the way.
Let's talk about geography. Seventh graders will use Mapping the World with Art to learn about the history of map making from the very earliest maps that are actually still in existence today that were drawn on clay by the people of Mesopotamia to the explorers who navigated the polar regions. These books also include map drawing lessons that take a student step by step through the process of drawing maps of all the countries of the world. They will also spend one term on historical geography as they read the book Daniel Boone by Cheryl Harness and explore the life of this frontiersman who explored beyond the western borders of the 13 colonies. Eighth graders spend the year studying U.S. geography in more detail as they make maps of the states, do map drills, and learn the rhyme and reason behind their shapes with the book Our States Have Crazy Shapes. Eighth graders will also explore geography as they read books about the historical time period. They will read the well-loved book Carry On, Mr. Bowditch, a fictionalized account of the life of Nathaniel Bowditch, who was born in Salem, Massachusetts in the late 18th century and is known for his work on ocean navigation. Eighth graders will also join the seventh graders for a term reading the book Daniel Boone. Geography in ninth grade includes map making and a look into how geography plays a role in history and politics through the book Prisoners of Geography, which is a favorite of many Alveary High School students.
There will be Canadian options for students in grade 7 and 8 to learn about geography. Canadian grade 7 students will learn alongside the US students with the book Mapping the World with Art, which Shannon just described. However, the mapping exercises that we will use in grade 7 for Canadian students are based on the Collins Canadian Student Atlas, and they will be learning features of Canadian geography. In grade 8, students will use this fun book called Draw the Natural World of Canada and Greenland, which will allow them to make a more detailed Canadian map and learn about specific bodies of water, landscape features, flora, and fauna. The idea is that you print out templates and then you add a lot of these details to each provinces. By the end of the year, you should have a pretty big map, and it gives instructions to also add animals and plants. So by the end of the year, you might have a map that looks like those of the early explorers that are decorated with all kinds of pictures of the sorts of things that you might find in those places. Grade 8 students will also read a book called Frances Barclay, 18th Century Seafarer. Frances Barclay was the wife of sea captain Charles William Barclay, and she's known as the first woman to circumnavigate the globe, although the author does let us know that she's the first woman to circumnavigate the globe who wasn't trying to dress up and pretend to be a man. Apparently, some of those preceded her. It's another book of creative nonfiction that the author has based on Frances Barclay's reminiscences that she wrote at the end of her life as she remembered taking this trip over a number of years with her husband around the world. But it's significant for Canadians because she spent a lot of time along the coast of British Columbia, and there are features of British Columbia geography that are named for both her and her husband. Barclay Sound is the traditional lands of the Huayot people who she encountered and described as meeting along the way. And we're going to be reading some of their oral histories in grade 7 and 8 history. So there's a really neat tie in there between the two subjects. And also, as we follow her all over the world, we're going to get a window into what the close of the 18th century looked like for places that are very, very far away from where she was from in England. And it's a wonderful look at what this time period looked like all over the world.
Let's talk about citizenship. 7th through 9th graders will be continuing their reading of Charlotte Mason's 4th volume entitled Ourselves. This book is best read with your students so you can discuss it and chew on the ideas of what it means to be human and how to understand the way God has made us. Next year for Plutarch, we'll be reading 2 lives. We use the Plutarch Project to read Alexander and Timoleon. Plutarch can seem overwhelming for some people, and so we provide a beginner's track for Plutarch as well. These lesson plans will cover 2 terms reading the life of Publicola. There will be more guidance, and the readings will be shorter for students that are new to this subject. We don't want you to miss the subject that Mason esteemed so highly. She stated in her book, School Education, perhaps nothing outside the Bible has the educational value of Plutarch's lives.
Let's look at government. The seventh graders will learn about the Constitution by reading the book, Your Rugged Constitution. This is a great book that goes through the text of the Constitution with accessible language, clear explanations, and drawings to bring out the concepts. We also include many links, articles, and videos in our lesson plans to help students gain an appreciation for our Constitution and the freedoms that we have in our country. In eighth grade, U.S. students will be studying state and local government. There isn't a book needed because lesson plans will include links and PDFs as well as activities for students to learn about the representatives and the laws in their own city and state. Eighth graders will also study a term of economics using the book Dollars and Cents, a kid's guide to using and not losing money. This book talks about the history of money, the first banks in America, and basic concepts of banking. The ninth graders will have a term of government where they will explore the philosophical foundations and the practical implications of the United States founding documents, looking at the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution.
Right, so then moving on into English for grammar and composition, we're continuing with the Michael Clay Thompson books. Seventh graders will use Paragraph Town, and eighth graders will be using Grammar Voyage and Practice Voyage. We really like the way that he talks about the ideas of language and the importance of knowing the parts of a sentence and how to write one well, so we can communicate and have an appreciation for the beauty of language. Then we move on to the writing of paragraphs and understanding how grammar helps us communicate clearly. This is a subject that should be done together with your student so that you can discuss the ideas and see how they are practically worked out. And this year, we're again providing copywork and dictation passages that come from this year's books up through eighth grade, and we will provide a packet for each student that will have the passages written out. Students are encouraged to find their own passages to copy as well, because obviously if they are interested in something, that would be much more important of something to copy and to use than just something that's been assigned for this age students especially. As students move into high school, they continue to practice writing in a wide variety of ways and also start learning more about specific forms of writing. One of those is the essay, and we use Essay Voyage by Michael Clay Thompson, grade 9, to introduce students to the basics of the essay form. He does a great job at explaining writing concepts in an engaging way with lots of examples from good literature.
Let's talk a bit about literature and poetry. And as we've mentioned before, literature, history, and geography are also tied together. For poetry reading, 7th and 8th graders will be reading Evangeline, and 9th graders will also have the option to read Hiawatha or The Courtship of Miles Standish. Although Longfellow didn't live during this year's time period, his famous poems give students wider exposure not only to poetry, but also to some key events like the Acadian expulsion, which happened in this history rotation. Grade 7 and up also start studying poetic forms more directly and gaining experience writing their own poems in a variety of forms, with books like What is Poetry in the 7th grade, The World of Poetry in 8th, and The Making of a Poem in 9th. Students also continue reading Shakespeare, and this year's plays are going to be Macbeth, Much Ado About Nothing, and Henry IV, Part 1.
And students are also reading some historical fiction and other longer texts written during the period. So one of them is Rosemary Sutcliffe's Black Ships Before Troy. So this kind of builds on a lot of the Greek mythology and Roman mythology they've been reading in earlier years, but then it's fun because this is also ties into our ancient history time period for this year. And so it's the story of the Iliad, and the 5th and 6th graders are also reading this book, but for 7th and 8th, we're adding more background and poetic commentary, and we're going to have them be reading some of the obviously still translated, but more direct translation of Homer's Iliad. So that kind of is a gentle bridge between 5th and 6th, and then where in 9th and up, they'll be reading the Odyssey. So that is a fun one. And then similarly, 7th and 8th was reading Nearer My Freedom, which is a found verse retelling of the life of Olaudah Equiano, which he wrote. So it's introducing students to the personal narrative sort of genre that is starts happening a lot more in this time period. But it's a really accessible book that when they say found verse, it basically means they took the larger narrative and kind of condensed it down using his own words into poetry. And so some of the key descriptive phrases or nouns or verbs. So it reads a little bit more smoothly and a little less graphically, which is helpful still at this age. And but also we're able to add in some of those sections of the original narrative as well in these lesson plans to give them a flavor of his actual narrative in addition to the sort of accessibility of this book. And that's another one that's shared with fifth and sixth grade as well, but sort of extending on that. And then another text from the period is that ninth grade is reading is this one called The Celebrated Cases of Judge Dee, an authentic 18th century Chinese detective novel. And despite an unfortunate cover image that you might want to edit, this is a fascinating collection of three interconnected detective mysteries, an entire century plus before Sherlock Holmes comes around. So it's just sort of fascinating that it exists in and of itself and gives students such a interesting window into something that's being written by this anonymous author, way over in Asia. But then also it's just morally and just the story itself is really rich, brings up a lot of questions about justice and what does justice look like, and the main detective, his name is Judge Dee, and he is just held up as a sort of very virtuous person and is trying to solve these mysteries in the most fair way possible, but then runs into lots of sort of moral quandaries along the way, and in terms of what does it look like to respect other people, and how do other people think about authority, and what does it look like to have people who are in authority over you as well as people who are in authority under you. So there's just a lot of really interesting and thought-provoking ideas in the story, and it's also really engaging. It's kind of a page turner, and it's also very authentic to the time period. The translator sort of specifically chose these stories when he came across them and was like, wow, I think this would be really interesting to translate into English. He specifically chose them because of their accessibility, but also their historical authenticity. He did a lot of research on the time period that this book is set in. So it's a 18th century author, 17th century author, writing about the 7th or 8th century in China. And so, he was just really impressed at how authentic the descriptions of the legal system was, in how the stories are told. So anyway, it's just a really interesting book. And then a historical fiction book, which the kids are reading, is My Brother Sam is Dead. It's a Newbery Honor book, and it's sort of well loved by a lot of people. And it puts kids right into New York during the American Revolution. And the main character, Tim, has a brother who signs up for and enlists in the American Continental Army. But then his father is a loyalist and fought in previous wars. And so it really raises questions just about the cost of the war, and invites students to grapple with just like what were the ideals they're fighting for, but then also the question of was this the only way? Like, was the bloodshed and just the horrific realities of the war, was it necessary? And kind of leaves that question sort of open-ended for students to really ponder. So those are a couple of the key books scheduled in literature.
Let's talk about art. All students study the same main artist over the year, but the lessons increase in depth as students grow. This year, we're studying paintings from Francis Barlow in Term 1. He was an illustrator and engraver, and one of the first artists to depict the natural world, especially the sport of English hunting, in his artwork. In Term 2, we will study Rachel Rausch, who was a still life painter during the Dutch Golden Age of art. And even though you probably haven't heard of her, her artwork sold for a lot of money during her lifetime, and she was a highly sought-out artist. And for Term 3, we will study John Singleton Copley, who is thought of as the first American artist because he lived and worked around the time of the Revolutionary War, and he painted many portraits of the men who would become America's founding fathers. Contrary to popular belief, he was not a great American patriot, but a British citizen, loyal to the crown until his death. We are also excited to offer two new courses for high school students, Art History and Fast Track Art for high school. Art history is an elective that will build on the many picture studies done through the years by combining interesting art projects paired with the various art movements on the timeline. And the fast track art lessons for high schoolers will be for those students who, for various reasons, did not have much art instruction through the lower years and now in high school would like to grow in this area. This course will take many of the main ideas from the art instruction courses and combine them into 1 year of high school art instruction.
That sounds great. I'm sure there'll be a lot of students who'll be able to benefit from that. We'll also be introducing handicrafts that were used during the ancient and colonial history time periods that we'll be studying. Colonial samplers that included the alphabet, numerals, and verses were very common in the 17th and 18th century as a way for young women to practice their needlework skills. For term one, students will learn to cross-stitch and make their own modern version of a colonial sampler, and certainly not something just for girls, because cross-stitch nowadays is not just for women. It is enjoyed by both genders all over the place. So it'll be fascinating for your students no matter. And in term two, students will continue to hone their hand-eye coordination and fine motor skills, as well as their spatial awareness through clay modeling. And for older students, we'll also offer lessons in Greek pottery. For the third term, students will learn how to do leather crafting with the guidance of videos in the book Get Started in Leather Crafting. Similarly, students study music connected to the historical time period for the year. So this year, students will listen to Vivaldi and Scarlatti, spend the Christmas season with Handel's Messiah, and finish the year with composers such as Ignatius Sancho. And while also students are enjoying these pieces, older students also explore extra instruments and pieces developing around the world. And hymns and spirituals and folk songs, they'll enjoy from people like John Newton and William Cooper. They'll learn folk songs like Yankee Doodle, a French voyager's paddling song, and even a simple Japanese folk song about cherry blossoms, which gained international fame. So our goal here is that students get an acoustic, visual, and hands-on experience of the times, in addition to experiencing the times in their imagination through their books.
Mason talks about the need for students to grasp that science is a process that develops and changes over time, right? It's the story of our struggle to understand creation and to search for truth, and that happens within the context of our human story. And so, over the course of grades 7 and 8, we use the story of science books, which are a set of 3 books that chronologically tell the story of how we began with stargazing and progressed to the eventual mind-bending concepts of Einstein. At the same time, the laboratory activities for this course guide the students through a complete physical science course. This text reads really well, it's very conversational, and one of the things that I really love about it just so much for this age group is that the author does such a great job of stimulating conversation. She will present one perspective, and then a chapter or 2 later, she will present the complete opposite perspective. So it really gets the teens thinking and talking, and there are just so many opportunities for the grand conversation here. Our 7th graders also have The Girl Who Drew Butterflies on their program. And our 8th graders have Invincible Microbe. So both of these texts provide lots of opportunities to think more deeply about how things in nature are connected. There's lots of historical context and so many great conversations about citizenship too that come in here. As students begin to transition into high school, you'll want to learn more about our flexible high school science program. It's ready to be fitted to your students' needs. So for more information about that and all of our other elective options, you can be sure to check out our high school science program intro video. Within that flexible program, we're recommending chemistry for our 9th graders. What I love about this text is that the authors truly believe that everyone can and should have an appreciation for chemistry. The voice reads like my favorite teachers and professors, and they're truly delighted and inspired by their subject. In fact, Dr. DaCosta not only co-authored the primary text for the course, but he also co-produced the Faraday candle lectures, which is where we're actually going to begin the course. So this little companion book is optional. The students will actually be watching the lectures online. Older editions of our primary text are readily available and they are perfectly fine to use. But I will say that the current edition has been very thoughtfully formatted and for some students is visually easier to read than the previous editions. The publisher also offers a digital ebook that is very reasonably priced with enhanced typesetting and audio. So there are just so many options to make this course accessible for everybody. And this course comes, of course, with our custom lab manual, and we also have a video teaching series for this course as well.
I hope you are excited about next year's books as much as we are. Thank you for joining us in this preview. You can find more samples on our website, a free set of lesson plans, and more information about the Alveary in our view book and on our YouTube channels. We are so excited for the adventures that await teacher and student this next year.